So thank you everybody for joining us today. We have an hour for this webinar, so it's going to go really quickly. And today we're going to focus on how to develop an effective public statement. So my name is Stephanie Ramos. At the Access California program, my role is the Director of Education, and so I do a lot of our training development, content development. So I get to spend a lot of time doing research and behind a computer. My role at NorCal MHA, I was a previous operations and HR manager, and now we're figuring out my new role as I've transferred over to Access. I've been at NorCal MHA. I want to say this will be my 13th year, so pretty much my whole adult life. And I work in the mental health field because I have a sibling who has, at some times, severe mental health challenges, and so I have firsthand experience in, with our system when it's not working effectively. And I'm really passionate and excited to work on a project where we actually get to advocate for much larger change, rather than sometimes feeling like our efforts don't get too far. So I'm a little excited about that. About NorCal MHA, we were founded in 1946. We're the oldest continuously operated consumer advocacy agency in California. We've been around a really long time, and we specifically hire people with lived experience. Majority of our staff, almost all of them, have their own personal experience with a mental health challenge. All of our managers and executive leadership have their own experience, as well as a majority of our board of directors. And so this project, this topic definitely is close to us, especially in a lot of the advocacy work that we do. For those of you that aren't too familiar with the Access program, it is a program of NorCal MHA. It's a consumer-led stakeholder advocacy program funded by the California Mental Health Services Act, also known as Proposition 63, and we receive our funding oversight and accountability. So Access stands for Advancing Client and Community Empowerment Through Sustainable Solutions. A lot of our passion and our focus really fits into what our name stands for. Our values are advocacy, recovery, and peer support. So around advocacy, it's about meaningful stakeholder participation, active solicitation of community feedback, expanding opportunities for the community to be involved in planning processes. And it's really about including the stakeholder voice at all levels, not just when we come up with ideas for plans, but how are we including stakeholders and evaluating those programs. We also value recovery. So it's really important to us and to the recovery movement. It's woven through the Mental Health Services Act, and that we want to infuse recovery principles in all levels of service delivery. And so we provide recovery-based training and support, and are really trying to infuse the intentions of the Mental Health Services Act into our full system. We are very passionate and committed to the fidelity around peer support. There's lots of roles where people may have an idea of how to do a job, but are we doing it the right way? And so providing education, training, and expanding that pool of peer supporters in our system. So as our Access program, we have 4 main functions. We do a whole lot of research to find out what's out there, what trends are coming out. Advocacy is a big piece of what we do. We provide advocacy on the state level, and we also work with stakeholders, community members, ambassadors to go out there and provide local level advocacy. We also provide education. It's great to tell people to go advocate, but we got to show people how to do that. So that's part of our project, as well as engaging. So engagement for us is about doing with people, not necessarily for. And so how are we getting people involved in a way that their voice can be heard, they can be at the table, and getting those people to the table so that they have opportunities to advocate. So today we're going to learn about local level advocacy opportunities, crafting an effective public statement, and making a good impression. So a lot of the local level advocacy opportunities are probably familiar to most of you. At the top, we have our local board of supervisors. Under that, we have our mental health board. We then have our division of behavioral health. And within the division of behavioral health, you'll find a cultural competence committee. And in some counties, you'll find the MHSA community planning process. It's important to mention that in some counties, the MHSA community planning process is actually a subcommittee of the mental health board. And so in those counties, the planning process actually falls under the Brown Act. And so I may possibly briefly touch on that. But the Brown Act is really focused on open meeting laws and making sure that people are getting notice, that a meeting is coming up, what action items are on the agenda, and creating a space for stakeholders and the public to give comment during those meetings. So when we want to be an effective advocate, there are some things that, we are really going to want to think about. And so a lot of times, especially myself, when I was a young person in the system, I would be like, hey, somebody would tell me to go advocate for something, or they would say what was going on, and I'd get encouraged to go to the podium, but was never really given clear direction on how to make an effective statement. And I think to start, it really, is following these 6 steps. And so making sure that we understand the issue. Are we selecting the right forum? Is it the right meeting to advocate at? Do we know our audience? Do we understand the meeting guidelines and rules? Have we taken time to develop a strategy? And have we effectively made our point? And so we're going to go into each of these. So when we think about understanding the issue, we might want to start with how common or widespread is the problem or issue that we want to advocate about. Does it only affect me and a very small group of people, or is this a bigger system issue that might address multiple people from different backgrounds, different programs? We want to figure out, how did we get here? And something that I know has been interesting for me is to we recruit people onto boards, onto committees, but don't often provide the historical context. And so people may advocate for an issue not knowing how we got here to begin with. And so we want to make sure that we've done our homework to find out, how did we get here? Were there events or instances that happened that created certain policies or procedures? Were there needs identified maybe 5 or 10 years ago that these plans are now being implemented to address? And so we want to figure out, how did we get here? What's already been done and why, right? Maybe there have already been things implemented that address this issue. And we may have an opinion on whether that is a good idea or a bad idea, but we want to know what has already been done and why was that implemented. What hasn't been tried and why? Sometimes it's not always clear to us and upfront that something had been tried in the past. So sometimes that goes back to how we got here. What might work and why? So I think for a lot of folks in general, I just think for people in general, it's really easy to identify what's wrong, to identify what the issue is. Sometimes it takes a little more homework to figure out, well, what is a potential solution? What might work and why might that work? And then we want to consider what competing interests are at stake, right? It's not just that there's one issue out in the world and my issue is the one that needs to get addressed. There may be competing interests. And so finding out what those are before we even make a strategy on how we want to approach our advocacy efforts. So the second piece is you want to select your forum. So where are you going to make a public statement at? That's a kind of key important thing to consider. Does the folks that are a part of the body that you're going to, do they have the authority and the influence to address the issue? Are you going to the right place to make your ask? And that's an important, piece to consider, because it could be very frustrating to go to multiple meetings, to advocate for an issue, and then we don't see any change happen. And so we want to make sure that we're going to the right meeting. We also want to consider, who is the body accountable to? Who's their boss, right? Or who's going to ask them questions? So we want to find out who are they accountable to and how are they accountable to them. And then considering, why is this the most appropriate place to make our statement? And so it could be appropriate or not appropriate for multiple reasons, right? Are we going highest up the chain first to advocate for an issue before going to maybe the the individuals that are more on the ground that can be addressing the issue? Are we going somewhere where they actually can make a difference in what it is that we're experiencing or what it is that we want to resolve? Do the individuals on the board or committee have an open ear to the issue that I have concerns about? So those are all some things that we want to consider when we select our forum. So I have to admit right now that videos do not always work in my webinars, and it might be me, I'm not sure, but I'm going to give this a shot. The audio is much more important than the actual visual part of the video. And so I'm going to have you guys take a look at this video, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk about it. If while playing, if for some reason you cannot hear the audio, please put that in the chat. And if we can't watch the video, I have an alternative way that we can have a discussion afterwards.
Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank Madam Mayor and the council members for your time. I prepared a little statement. I'm here on behalf of the Santa Clarita foodie community, and I was wondering, is there a Spanish translator available by any chance, just to not exclude the Hispanic community?
No, usually we try to do that in advance.
Okay. So I'll just get into it. In 1982, a boneless barbecue pork sandwich was introduced to the United States, and it was available for only a limited time during the fall, which is called the McRib. But this year, McDonald's, they decided to give regional managers the power to decide whether to sell the McRib at their locations. And apparently only 55% of McDonald's franchises nationwide have chosen to sell the McRib, which means 45% have decided to skip it, including the Santa Clarita area. And there are 10 McDonald's here in Santa Clarita, and none of them are selling the McRib. And specifically the McDonald's on Shaquilla Lane next to In-N-Out is not selling it, and it's been replaced by an all-day breakfast, which I think is like a really poor substitute. And consumers have had to resort to the McRibLocator.com, which gives disappointing results if you use it, because the nearest sandwich was seen in the Bay Area. And to be honest, like the removal of the McRib from the menu has affected my family, because every Thanksgiving, my family would like order a 50-piece chicken McNugget and like 10 McRibs. It was like a tradition in our family. And now it's like, well, like my family's holiday spirit's kind of messed up and broken. So basically what I'm trying to say is I come to you in this matter that I hope you members of the council can help and speak to these McDonald's managers, because I tried calling the hotline and they like don't take me seriously. So I don't know, to me, like Thanksgiving for my family without this like McRib is like a Christmas like without snow. It just doesn't make sense. So thank you for your time and listening, and happy Thanksgiving.
So guys, I'm gonna unmute everybody. So I hope that was a little bit of a light-hearted public statement to watch for you all. So for those on the line, what issue was the speaker addressing?
The availability of the McRib sandwich.
Right, so we know what the issue was, right? So she did great in expressing what the issue was. So how well did she seem to understand the issue?
Very well.
Right, she did her homework, right? She like explored where the nearest one was, identified how it impacted her and her family. So the specific issue of the McRib not being nearby, she understood the issue. So what was the speaker asking the city council to do?
To bring back.
Okay, and do folks feel that she was clear in her ask?
Yes.
Yes, right? Do something about it. I called McDonald's already and they don't take me seriously. So what authority do you think the city council had to address the issue?
None.
None.
How funny, Nina.
And was this the most appropriate forum to address this issue? Why or why not?
Wrong forum. You should have gone to a McDonald corporate office or individual location.
Right. And so her passion was there. She was able to express how it impacted her and her family. She had an ask, but she went to a body that really couldn't do a lot about it. And so it's not that, we want people to advocate and voice what their needs are, especially how things impact them. But it can be really frustrating if we go somewhere who really has no authority in addressing our issue, right? We're knocking at a lot of wrong doors. So another thing we want to consider is, who's our audience? Do we know our audience? So we want to know, what are the political backgrounds and leanings of the members? What do they care about? And what do they care about is important to know, because often I think we get caught in the issue that we're advocating for without identifying the why. Why are we advocating for this issue? What is the impact? And how can we make this important to the individuals who are making the decisions, right? And so sometimes we may have the same goal, but we express it in a different way, or we ask for something different, but we're trying to get to the same place. And so we want to figure out, what do the people on the board care about, or on that committee? What are they, why are they on the committee? How have they voted on similar issues in the past? Have they voted for? Have they voted against? Are they in support of the type of issue that you're advocating for? And this may be important to know, right? Because if I, want to meet with someone to discuss an issue that's coming up, am I going to spend my time maybe with someone who I know is a strong no against the issue that I'm advocating for? Or, and maybe I know someone is a strong yes. Well, maybe I can briefly talk with them, but what about the people who are kind of in the middle, right? What do they care about? Maybe they don't have a strong stance on either side. And then as far as knowing our audience, what arguments might be the most convincing to each member? So that really goes back to, what do they care about, right? How can, I help folks to connect my issue to whatever it is that they care about, what they feel is important in our communities. So you also want to ensure that you understand the meeting guidelines. There's been a lot of committees that I've been on where folks come and speak about an issue that's not on the agenda. And that is fine. It's totally fine, because it's usually during general public comment, people can bring up any issue, even if it's not on the agenda. However, if you want there to be a certain decision made, you want to see, is this issue gonna be on an upcoming agenda? Will this be talked about it? So that I can get more information about, what the plans might be, or what people are considering. And then I can actually have a voice when decisions are being made. And so, we want to understand not only what the meeting guidelines are, but is the issue that I'm coming, to this board about, is it relevant right now to them? You also want to consider how much time you have to speak. In most public meetings, during public comment, you generally have about 3 minutes, but recognize that that sometimes is shortened based on, whether or not the meeting has gone over, or if there are a lot of people who are planning to make public comment. So you want to be able to think about, if I only have 3 minutes, how am I going to use that 3 minutes most effectively to get my message across to the individuals that might be making a decision? And then you want to find out, are there any other procedural rules that they follow that you need to keep in mind? Right? So, and that could vary based, on that body. There are some boards or committees that if you ask a question during public comment, they'll answer you. There's other boards and committees that does not respond to public comment. They just listen to it. And so you want to find out, are there any rules that the body follows that you want to keep in mind as you're developing your strategy to advocate for a specific issue? I should have pushed that button. So if your issue isn't on the agenda, just recognize that you'll probably need to make your comment in general public comment. So in most public meetings, if they are making a decision on something, there's usually an opportunity to voice your opinion on that issue prior to them voting. But again, if it's not on the agenda, typically your comment will have to wait until general public comment, typically at the end of the meeting. Other procedural rules to consider would be the Brown Act. So on the local level, having public meetings, having notice so that people are aware that meetings are happening, for folks to know what's on the agenda. There's also a Bagley-Keene Act, and that is kind of the open meeting laws for statewide committees or boards. There's also city or county ordinances that sometimes are in play in your local communities. And so if you yourself, or if you know someone that's a little more seasoned in that area, it would be good to maybe look those up or have a conversation with someone who has some experience to know how those impact the meeting. And then there may also be bylaws or Robert's Rules of Order. I know that in some counties they have a comfort agreement, or they have other meeting rules on how people are supposed to engage with each other during the meeting. So that might be an additional thing that that boards or committees might have in place. And so, you want to do a little bit of homework, find out how those meetings run. And sometimes it's just going to them is how we find that out. The fifth step is to develop a strategy. So we first want to figure out, what do we want to accomplish, right? What is our ask? Because that needs to be clear. What are the challenges? What's getting in the way, right? How can we get it done? So thinking about, alternatives, different boards and committees we may be able to go to, different individuals that are in decision-making seats that we can contact. Where do we start, right? Are there other groups, individuals, organizations that are, focused on the same issue we are? Maybe there's an opportunity to collaborate. We also want to think, what's the next step? So even if I made a statement, I may want to think about, what am I going to do next? Am I going to follow up with an email, a phone call? What might that look like for me? What are you comfortable with? Where can you go to accomplish your goal? So I think, kind of going back to that video, are we finding the right audience? And in addition to where can you go to accomplish your goal, sometimes it's also when, because timing can make a big difference. And then recognizing who has the power to make things happen. And so knowing what are the various avenues to get your voice heard and possibly the issue addressed, but you kind of have to back up a little bit to create a strategy to know, how am I going to be able to do this effectively so that all of my efforts, are maximized. I don't want to waste my own time maybe going into arenas where maybe people aren't open to hearing it, that, they don't have any authority to address the issue. It's not relevant to them. So trying to find out, what is the low-hanging fruit, who may have that open mind, and how do I get my first step in the door? So some factors to consider is, first, who's your audience, right? That might influence your, what you say, how you say it, how you dress when you go to make your public statement, right? If I'm going to the Board of Soups, I might dress differently than if I was going to my local, maybe if I had I'm trying to think what we have in our local community. But if I might dress differently going to a Board of Supervisors versus going to a local client network or something like that. So thinking about who your audience is can help address and mold whatever approach you may be taking. How much should you share? That's a big one. I think that a lot of people in general, even myself, when we get in front of a microphone, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking. And so we want to kind of take some time to practice and also think about not only how much do I want to share, but how much do I want to disclose about myself? Recognizing that, what I do in public is public and maybe written down somewhere and maybe blasted all over the internet, like we never really know. And so we want to also think about, while protecting ourselves, how much should we share in those venues? And then to consider, why am I sharing this? Sometimes we share things because we have a need to share or we have a need to be heard. But we want to think about, as we're sharing, is it relevant? Is it helpful? And who is it helpful to? Is me sharing helpful to me, or is it helpful to the listener, right? So also when we're thinking about advocating for an issue, we want to think about, is what I'm saying effective? Is it helpful? Is it helping steering people in the right direction? So impressions matter. And I don't know about folks on the line, but when someone makes a public statement, actually in anything that we do, we quickly make assumptions about people, right? Based on how they dress, based on how they carry themselves, based on how they talk, based on how they express their feelings or emotions. We tend to judge people. So especially when we're advocating, more specifically in a way that might not always be going with the flow, people sometimes make judgments, right? And that can be damaging in some ways, because if people make negative judgments about us, then they may not listen to what we have to say anymore. Or they don't think that we're credible when we, start to speak about an issue. And so we want to think about the impression we make. And sometimes this is personal, right? Some people don't care. Like, I don't care what they think about me. And if you're comfortable with that, then that's awesome for you too, right? I wish I was a little more like that. But we want to think about, what do you want people to say about you after you made a public statement? So we'll let you think about that for a second. What do you want people to say about you after you make a public statement? And then what could you do so that people might say those things about you? Right? It does not mean that we're compromising our passion or our vision, or that we're going to, be silent on something that, is impacting our communities, but to think about, we are making an impression when we make our public statements, and that sometimes can open doors or close doors to having conversations with people that can make those decisions. It's not always fair, but it is something that I've learned over the years does have an impact on people's ability to advocate. So for folks on the line, why do you think it's important to think about making an impression when we're making our public statement? Anybody on the line? Anyone that's made a public statement before or seen one that was like, So,
Stephanie,
yes.
Stephanie, this is Bill.
Hey, Bill.
It's my experience that when a person's making a public statement, that they need to be real knowledgeable about their topic and be able to address the topic in a fashion that the audience listening understands they know what they're talking about. Because if you get up there and you're all over the place with it, then they're going to think, well, you know, he doesn't even know what he's talking about, but he's up here talking. Or if you go off on a tangent and it takes you away from the topic that you started with, then you're going to lead people away from what you're trying to address.
Right, absolutely. Megan on the chat says, if we're asking for something, we want to be sure that we're clear, concise, and respectful. Great point, Megan. Any other thoughts on this one?
Hello, this is Leslie Napper. Can you hear me?
Hi, Leslie.
Hi there. I think one of the my experience is to you know, share your passion, but again, be concise and agree with what Megan stated. But also not just state the issue, but maybe offer a solution. Like, give them ideas to how to resolve how to resolve an issue. That's important instead of just leaving a question dangling in the air.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. I know for myself, when I first started in this work, I was really young. I was 19, and I probably looked like I was 16. And just being a young person, impressions really mattered because people would brush me off sometimes as, oh, it's the youth. And I wouldn't always have that credibility. And so I had to dress a level up when I went to these meetings. I had to make sure that my statement was very clear and concise and on point, because it took a while to build, you know, I'm trying to think of what word I'm thinking of. But for people to think that I knew what I was talking about, like it took a while to get that respect. And so, you know, especially if we are from the client consumer community, there are people that have a bias or their own judgment. And so we want to think about, you know, how our impression can help us open doors in some ways if we're able to do it the right way. So your impression that you make to others is personal. And so it's not what anybody, you know, no one should be telling you what type of impression you should make, but find out, you know, what is going to be most effective for you and what are you most comfortable with. So when you're making your statement, there's some things that you want to emphasize. So if your goal is to educate people, then you want to focus on facts and figures. What data can be used to best support your arguments, right? It's not just about my opinion, but here's the data, here's the facts. You may also want to share a personal story. You know, maybe share your personal experience with the issue that you're talking about, or how that issue has impacted you or other people. So it's not, you know, always necessarily that we feel a certain way or what we want, but being able to identify what are the facts and then to communicate what is the impact that this is having on people. If your goal is to build connection, you may want to talk about how the issue relates to your audience. So going back to what is important to them, right? Finding that out. Your understanding of competing priorities and the audience's perspective. Like, do you understand that, you know, my issue is not the only issue on the table? There are other things that we're considering. And so having empathy towards those people that are making those decisions, while also making it relevant to them, can really assist you in building that connection. And if your goal is to advocate, you want to focus on what would help, what would be more effective than what the status quo is. What works somewhere else, right? Maybe you've seen something work, and so you can bring that and share that with the folks that you're advocating to. You know, what is the impact of the systematic barriers? We might want to talk about that if we're advocating for an issue. And like Leslie just mentioned, you know, can we talk about solutions? Because I think just in general, we're all quick to complain, and but often we don't get provided with solutions to an issue. So if we can bring solutions to what that is, then it really shows that we are open to the process, that we want to work together, that we're willing to collaborate, and that we're really focusing on moving forward and being successful. Rather than fighting and trying to stop things, we can propose solutions to what those issues might be. So we want to also think about, as we're advocating, are we promoting recovery values? So SAMHSA has 10 guiding principles of recovery. So the first one is hope, right? Having hope that things will change or things will get better. Because if I don't think things will get better, what is the point in trying? It's person-driven, right? We hear in the term in our system, we hear client-driven a lot, right? But it's driven by the individual who's managing their own condition. It's not driven by the system. And in this way, we think about that, recovery comes from within. It doesn't happen to us, right? So it's person-driven. There are many pathways to recovery, right? It's not just a one-way approach. We need to think about, what are the strengths and assets that people have in their lives and how they can use those to find their pathway or maintain their pathway to recovery. We take a holistic approach, so not just looking at, med management and system reduction, but thinking about, quality of life. Are people happier, right? Are they fulfilled? When we're advocating, also considering peer support and how lived experience brings value to the mental health system. That these interactions and systems and services are relational, right? We're not robots. It's about relationships. Are we considering culture, right? And I think that goes back to many pathways and person-driven, is that, culture has a big impact on how the system treats individuals being served and how people being served react to that system. We want to consider trauma. We really want to focus on strengths and responsibility and respect. So when we're thinking, about advocating for an issue, are we also thinking about, what does this look like through a recovery lens? How could this look different through a recovery lens? And I think if we're looking at these guiding principles of recovery, it's really helping us to uphold the Mental Health Services Act and that system transformation that it was intended to do. So the sixth part of making a public statement is making your point. And so there's three parts. You have your introduction, you have your substance, and then you have your conclusion. And so after I go through this slide, I hope I can do this. I'm going to try to pull up an attachment that we had added to the GoTo training. And so if I'm not able to pull it up, all of you that registered should have access to this document that you can actually download and use, or you can share it with other people. So part of making your point obviously starts with an introduction. So you want to state who you are and where you're from, right? Your name, what county, what area of the county do you live in, things of that nature. You want to state the issue or the problem that you're going to talk about. So it's your quick intro, and it includes your ask. So what do you want to have happen? So this is all in your introduction. 3 quick sentences: who you are, where you're from, the issue you're going to talk about, and what your ask is. Now your substance can vary a little bit, but it's not going to be that long. You want to explain how the issue is impacting you, people close to you, people like you, and or the community at large. You want to talk about why the current situation is not working, or why the proposed action is going to be ineffective. And then come up with a solution, right? So back to what Leslie said. We might be able to identify what's not working, how it impacts us, but do we have a solution? Can we help together fix the problem? And why is the solution that you're proposing better than the status quo or the proposed action? What would the outcome be? So again, this isn't very long. It's pretty brief. And you want to wrap up in your conclusion by restating your ask, exactly what you want the body to do, right? We want our ask to be clear at the beginning so they know what we're wanting. We can explain the justification, the facts, the reasons, potential solutions, and we're going to end with, again, restating what our ask is so they know exactly what it is that we're wanting. And then a thank you, right? So in total, this is only 12 to 16 sentences. And that idea actually makes me feel less stressed. I think I wish I would have learned this earlier in my advocacy career, because I often got thrown in front of a microphone and really didn't have a format that would help me effectively advocate for whatever issue it is that's affecting me. This outline is definitely not set in stone. I would encourage people to make it their own, but we found that at least these components can be really helpful in clearly explaining what the issue is, what solutions we're proposing, and what we want the body to do. And so I'm going to see if I can open up this document. For those of you in the GoTo training module on your computer, I believe on the right you have a tab that says materials. And the materials there, it's called an advocacy worksheet. And so I'm going to try to open this, and if anybody in the chat can let me know if you can see this or not. So if I could get a yes or a no from anyone, that would be awesome. Yes, okay. So thank you, Terrence, appreciate it. So my computer is freezing. Okay, here we go. So this advocacy worksheet, we kind of developed as an easy handout for people to use in crafting their public statement so that it didn't seem so overwhelming. And I may not be able to scroll down because I am getting the spiral of death that my computer likes to give me sometimes. But you all should be able to download this now as well as after the webinar for your use. So it kind of breaks down the what we had gone over in the slides. And so it's just kind of in a one-sheet page. And so it starts with doing your homework. Do you really understand the issue? Identifying what venue, looking at, what authority do they have? Are they accountable to any other group? And then identifying who's on the committee. Do they support these issues, oppose them? How have they voted before? Considering the different rules and laws in place. So these are all things for us to be thinking about. Let's see. Okay, can people see this? Can everyone see this one? I saw a couple folks say that they couldn't see it. I'm hoping so. So, like I said, this is a quick 2-page sheet. So if you have not written a public statement before, or you're trying to find a more effective way, or you're working with people and trying to help them create a public statement for maybe an upcoming meeting or board, this is a quick and easy way to get people started. And I think it takes a little bit of stress off because it really breaks it down so that you can create a concise public statement. And so, like I mentioned, this should be available for you guys to download. I believe when folks registered, you had to put your email in. So if folks are interested, I can email out the slide deck as well as the advocacy worksheet handout. So here are some quick additional tips. First, dress the part. And dress the part, so dress appropriately for that meeting. If the meeting that you're going to is a little laid back, the members wear jeans, you might not want to show up in a suit. So you want to think about, how do you want to appear? So that goes back to making an impression. Be positive, right? Try to have good energy, right? Good energy attracts people. Make eye contact. And that may or may not be appropriate depending on the audience, depending on the individual. But at least try to make comfortable eye contact and try not to read your statement. It doesn't mean that you can't read your statement. But, especially if you've prepared, maybe practice, then you may have it under your belt a little bit. You want to use a conversational tone. I don't know what that means for each individual person. But I think it's really about trying to be relaxed. Consider that a first person statement can build connection. You want to focus on one issue at a time. let's see, I'm hearing, okay, I hear people might not be able to see. I hope you can see again. You want to offer solutions. So again, going back to, we might identify an issue, we may even have a complaint, but we want to make sure that we are providing solutions, or at least an open mind and willingness to collaborate with whatever board or committee that is to find a solution. And then if possible, you want to submit a written copy of your statement. And I think it's really helpful because sometimes there are staff who are having to take minutes or record meetings, and it's a lot for people to have to, you know, word for word, remember or type out exactly what your statement was. And so if you can write it, then it's a way to be sure that the statement that you made was presented and delivered in the way that you intended. And so it's important to submit a written copy if you have it. Also, if you're working with people who may be nervous about, you know, making a public statement out loud, they can always submit a written statement at the meeting without having to get up and say it out loud. And so I definitely want to encourage people to say things out loud, but for folks that might not be comfortable, there's still opportunity for them to submit a written statement. So sharing done right, it inspires hope. It builds mutuality and it reinforces equality, right? So we're in this together. It creates trust. It provides a model for change. It reduces stigma, right? So I'm sharing, somebody may have a preconceived notion of who I am or what I'm like. And when I share correctly, it can reduce stigma that other people may put on me based on their judgments or bias. And it also promotes personal empowerment, right? It feels good when you did a public statement right. And I think that can be connected to having a mastery experience where I tried something and I did it successfully. And so I feel more confident doing it again. And that's a really, really important piece that I think we need to think about more when we're having people advocate, right? We want it to be a good, successful experience so that folks can come back again and feel like they have a voice. Sharing done wrong, it can discourage hope. It can reinforce the power imbalance. It can trigger and sometimes re-traumatize people. Sharing done wrong can sometimes keep people stuck, right? It could keep maybe me, the speaker, stuck. If I'm very kind of drilled down in what I'm upset about without thinking about collaboration or you know, compromise or solutions. And sometimes it keeps the other people stuck, right? Maybe I could have gotten them onto my side, but the way I presented kind of, you know, had them stop their feet down and are holding to what they originally decided. It could increase stigma. And at its worst, it decreases credibility, right? So we want to make sure we're not sharing wrong, because once individuals feel like we're not credible, it's going to be very difficult for them to hear us in the future, even if we're right. And so, you know, we want to consider what those longer term effects could be, depending on whether our statement went well or whether it didn't. Tyrone on the chat says, done correctly, they're all well informed and want to pursue the subject matter further, right? At the very least, it starts a conversation. And so it's a really great point. Thanks for adding that. So I'm going to open up I'm going to unmute everybody again if I can find it. And I want to ask you all, what are some pros and cons of disclosing your status as a client or consumer, or details of your lived experience to an audience of strangers? Any thoughts on that one?
Well, some of the pros to disclosing your experience, your lived experience, is that you might connect more with them, as long as you don't go too deep into it. You know, you have to be careful about how much you do expose.
Yeah, absolutely. What other pros and cons? Go ahead.
This is Shirley. It's also important to remember to not disclose someone else's story or their experience. It's your story and your experience.
Absolutely. That is huge. And I'll do a quick disclosure. When I first started doing this work as a youth, I got pushed out on a stage a lot to tell my story. And I did not know any better, and I put my parents on blast. I kind of I overshared, and I shared things about my family and my parents and my siblings that I didn't have their permission to share that. And later, my mom wanted to get a job as a family advocate in our local public mental health system. And after I had done all that on stage multiple times, I am sure places were a little hesitant. And she would be great in that role, but I did not ever think about the unintended consequences of sharing my story and details of my family story so openly, right? And now that I know better, even though it's probably a little bit too late, I'm a lot more careful in how I talk about it. And I've recognized that even though my family members may have had a part in my story is my story. I don't have to tell theirs, right? And I think sometimes we're quick to tell other people's, especially family members, if we're not aware that we have our own story to tell. And so definitely, Shirley, we want to be careful in sharing other people's stories or perspectives, experiences, behaviors, things like that.
And this is Leslie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think one of the pros is by standing up and disclosing, it really shows the power of wellness and recovery. It's like modeling wellness. Also, too, it helps people identify why the issue is so impactful, and then the decisions that they make. How this could impact me and how I am like so many. But at the same time, one of the negatives about disclosing is that we really have to be our own wellness when we get ready to do that and not get caught up in our story because it's easy to lose sight of the issue.
Absolutely, right? And I think like what you mentioned is, finding out if we're using our story, what parts are we comfortable with sharing? Have we practiced sharing? And it's important to practice sharing any disclosures that we're going to make, because in thinking about sharing it and actually sharing it, it may be a very different experience. And so we want to make sure we're not triggering ourselves when we're up there trying to make a public statement. And so Leslie, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a really important piece. So what are some ways you can manage the audience's perception of you?
I think everything that you stated in the training so far is, dress appropriately, know what, come with your issue, be concise and clear. So just set those first impressions. Those are really good things to practice. Write it down. Write your issue down, your talking points. It's important because it's easy to get in front of that microphone and have a time clock in front of you and just forget everything you came there for. So being prepared, I guess, well prepared is really a key in setting, that first impression.
Yeah, absolutely. Being consistent is also important. If I've done a lot of talking in meetings, and more recently I was a little triggered in a meeting and reacted very differently than I usually have in the past. And I was triggered and I was upset, and I imagined it came off that way. But I do think that my previous behavior and experiences in those meetings made that moment forgivable, because it was for me out of the norm. And if I was upset, it was probably more legitimate, because usually that wasn't a behavior or a way that I would have acted otherwise. And so it doesn't mean that you're never going to have a moment, but the more consistent we can be, I think can help keep people's ears open, even when we have maybe that very passionate moment that they may take differently from somebody else. And then lastly about this, I just wanted to mention that I was in a meeting recently where somebody gave a public statement, and I was really triggered. And somebody else afterwards got up to make a public statement, and I was nervous about it. And the first thing they said is that how much they appreciated that all voices were welcome at the table. Even if I was triggered or disagreed, right? They were all welcome at that table. And I think just by starting with that, I think really opened everybody to hearing the message that followed. And so I think even though people have opinions about how people stand on certain issues, you know, we want to make sure that as much as we want a safe space to advocate and to speak our truths, I think it's important that we are also honoring that safe space for all the voices at the table also. And so that's just food for thought. But that was something very powerful I experienced recently. And even though I've been doing this work for a long time, kind of had me do my own self-reflection and how, you know, how I would respond to that type of trigger in a meeting. So practice is essential. So important to practice. And having you, I mean, definitely I encourage you to take a look at that worksheet because you can kind of write it out, edit, maybe add something, take things out, practice, see how it flows. Because people who don't practice tend to overshare. I didn't think about how much to share, maybe just got up there and started talking and overshared in a lot of instances. They may dwell on the negative, right? A lot of times when someone's making a public statement, it's because something came up for them and it's not always positive. And so they may be dwelling in negative if they haven't taken time to practice. You may regret your choice of words later. I have spoken at times where I didn't prepare, and then when I went home, all I kept thinking about was what I said and how I could have said it differently. It wasn't the end of the world, but it would have been nice to not have to go through that after the meeting. And then in the chat, Octavia just said, let someone hear what you plan to say. That's a great idea, right? Like maybe I'm going to practice it in front of someone else and they can let me know how it comes off. Octavia also said, be prepared, be clear, try to speak in a manner that you can be understood and be calm. And then one last thing that folks may experience if they don't practice is experiencing strong emotions that get in the way of the statement. And I think that goes back to practicing, really thinking about, you know, what you want to disclose. If you're going to make a disclosure, practice that, see how it feels, see if you're ready to share that. Because, you know, whatever we do get out there and say technically becomes public information. And so we want to think about how much do we want to share? When do we want to share? And what's the most effective way to do that? So it is 2:59. This is like timing of the year. So to wrap it up, today we learned about local level advocacy opportunities, crafting an effective public statement, and making a good impression. And so I am proud of all of that, all of us, that we got through that in exactly 1 hour. I am going to get the PowerPoint slide deck as well as the advocacy worksheet, and I will get those emailed out to folks who put their email in the registration when they signed up for the webinar. I know folks have tight schedules and may have to get off. So if you don't have any questions or discussion, have a wonderful rest of your day. And for folks who want to stay on the line, I'm just going to be on here for a few minutes. But again, thank you everybody who joined us today.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's Leslie.
Yay! I'm so glad you were on here.
Oh, me too. It's great. Are you going to be able to mail the materials? Because that's good stuff.
Yes, I'm going to email it.
Thank you again. I really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your personal story with us.
Oh, thank you, Leslie. I'll see you soon.
Yes, you will. Bye.
I have a question. This is Shirley.
Hi, Shirley.
Hi. I've noticed when I've watched on TV the city council sessions, a person will get up and speak, and then oftentimes that'll be it and they'll just sit down. But sometimes one of the council members will ask them a follow-up question. And I was wondering, other than just being really well prepared, how do you prepare for that incident to happen when somebody asks you another question and you have to just extemporaneously respond?
I think if you have a response ready, you can respond. But I think you can also say, oh, like I didn't necessarily prepare to discuss that in my public comment, but I would be happy to talk with you after the meeting.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.